interesting speakers with different perspectives on a whole range of countries in the region. So we're very glad you could join us. Just before we get going, a couple notes. First of all, I'd like to thank Carnegie Corporation of New York and George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs and the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies for supporting our program, including this series. In terms of how we'll go, we'll ask each of the four speakers to talk for hopefully no more than 10 minutes each, so we can have plenty of time for discussion at the end. And then after all the speakers have gone, I will start the question and answer session. And what I would encourage you to do is submit questions to us through the chat mechanism. You can do that either to everyone or to me or to Madeline, who is behind the scenes moderating. And then what I'll do is I'll try to gather questions, maybe group them by theme if an obvious theme emerges, and try to distribute the questions evenly across the panelists. So I may not take the questions in order. So please, we welcome your questions and comments or things for the speakers to react to. So without further ado, let me introduce today's first speaker. Will be Nikolai Petrov, who is Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House in London now, and he will be talking on transforming Russia's political regime. So Nikolai, the floor is.
Thank you so much, Hen. And thanks a lot for having me. I would prefer to speak in person, and perhaps next time it will be possible to do this. But let me try to explain how political transformation in Russia looks like from my point of view. First of all, the regime is experiencing the large-scale transformation, the one it has never experienced before. And that's why nobody can be sure in the final result. And it's going on not only according to a kind of master plan, but there are essential elements of improvisation. And the general aim is to make a kind of authoritarian reset and to change political machinery in a way allowing it to work efficiently without daily management from Putin's side. So it should allow Putin to keep in power beyond 2024 without constant control and manual management. And it should enable Putin to switch the system to a kind of autopilot regime without A, being overloaded with daily duties, and B, letting anybody to concentrate too much power in his or her hands. In terms of Henry Hale's concept of power pyramids evolution in post-Soviet space, it means first establishing single pyramid system with nobody else except the leader having a kind of full control over the whole thing. That's why we'll not see a kind of successor. And second, switching to the model of several partial successors controlling sub-pyramids. So it should be a kind of collective sub-leadership model. And let me present several details. First of all, what's going on in Russia this year, is going on with political transformation as a major framework and the constitutional reform, and there is emergence of new political and governance design, not necessarily by means of the constitutional reform, but by means of presidential decrees. So far, we do have the State Council and its presidium, working groups of the State Council. Sergei Sobyanin is the head of the most visible one dealing with COVID pandemic. We do not know who should be the State Council secretary. He is not appointed yet. Personal composition in general is unknown. However, the model of expanded meetings of the presidium works since 2018. We do have absolutely new Commission on the Promotion of International Development, led by Dmitry Kazak, which, in my view, looks as a quasi-government dealing with all Russia's activities beyond its borders. And we do have another quasi-government represented by the bank web, RF, where Igor Shuvalov is the boss. It should deal with national development in general. And the recently announced reform of the so-called development institutes is aimed to concentrate all of them, or majority of them, under the umbrella of this web RF. So it looks like, although Mishustin got much more freedom in shaping his government than any other prime minister in recent Russian history, powers of his government are limited, first of all, by these two newly established institutions. In spite of transforming, the system is doing many things as usual, like, say, political repressions are going on, both anti-elite repressions and repressions against civil society and citizens. In case of political elites, they do play both instrumental and preventive role, with governors and mayors being at risk. And here, two recent cases of Sergei Furgal, the former governor of Khabarovsky Krai, and Ivan Klein, the former mayor of Tomsk, come to mind. These repressions do have demonstrative character, which is peculiar for informational authoritarianism. And there are repressions against journalists, against scientists, against civic activists, and we can discuss this in more details perhaps later. Law enforcement, in turn, is not only the subject of repressions, but an object for repressions as well. So it's possible to speak about cleansing of cleansers. And first of all, we do have prosecution, which used to be the corporation under Yuri Chaika, personal control. Now it's transforming, but it's transforming not in direction of being more transparent, more just, and so on. It's transforming to be under total Kremlin's control. And we do have replacement of three major investigators in the country, the one at FSB, the one at Ministry of Interior, and at Investigative Committee. And there are large-scale replacements at the level next to the top, going on at the Supreme Court, the Moscow City Court, judiciary in general. If to speak about opposition, one can say that it's not that evident, it's not that effective. Systemic opposition represented by communists and liberal Democrats, first of all, they do continue to be loyal to the Kremlin, but at a higher price. Non-systemic opposition is pretty weak, and they did distance from Putin's plebiscite, which I think was a serious mistake. There are some positive achievements like smart voting in municipal elections, but it's about local successes. And it looks like investigative journalism now in Russia, including this recent case with Navalny's poisoning, did replace opposition in general. And the pressure onto civil society is going on, and there are draconian new laws, including on foreign agents and so on. So let me let me finish with how, in my view, the prospects for future look like. First of all, it's not that easy to speculate, as the epidemic and its influence on economy and society can play a very important role. But what we should see I think, will be large-scale personnel replacements, including as heads of Siloviki agencies, heads of highest courts, party leaders, and many other top persons among Russian political elites. We should see elections to the State Duma, where the Kremlin has a plan to keep a qualified majority, which I think is almost impossible without large-scale fraud, which can cause social unrest. And what is important, in my view, with regard to political transformation, it's first the fact that now existing institutions are weakened and they do not play any serious role in this ongoing transformation, and they should be replaced by new institutions which are already established. But these new institutions should start working, and it's not that easy to imagine that it will take place without any conflicts, crisis, and everything else. The second problem is connected with the fact that political repression so far did provide for all major potential players keeping motionless. It's possible to compare this with the effect of anesthesia, but nobody knows whether it will be possible for a patient to recover after this anesthesia, and whether it will be possible for the Kremlin to stop practicing political repressions in a scale they are practiced now. And the final point is connected to the vision how Russian political system should look after this transformation. In my view, it will look in a way of multi-headed hydra instead of two-headed eagle, with Vladimir Putin staying at the very top and with several guys, none of whom should concentrate full power, staying at the next level, represented by those quasi-governments I did mention, Mishustin's government, Siloviki government headed by the Security Council, and state companies which are controlled directly by the president, not by Russian government. And it's not that easy to imagine that this very complicated system will work efficiently. Let's wait. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So let's turn now to our second speaker, Danielle Lucier, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Grinnell College, and she will be talking about the political participation that enables Putin. Danielle, it's yours.
Thank you. I'm just getting my PowerPoint up. So this is a great transition from Nikolai. I'm going to talk, instead of talking about the elite level, I'm going to talk a little bit about the mass level. And I'm going to start off by sharing with you just this graph that's Putin's approval ratings going back over the past 20 years. And when we discuss Putin's approval, we're often focused on its relative decline in recent years compared to its earlier peaks. But it's worth bearing in mind that his approval rating has remained consistently high, almost at 60%. Even in the most recent iteration of Levada data from November of this year, Putin's approval rating was at 65%. And to me, this raises the question of why. You know, what explains this sustained high approval rating over time? And rather than suggest the popularity of any particular policy or Putin's personal appeal, I'm going to argue that this approval is related to specific participatory mechanisms that Putin has put in place to preempt the types of issues that could lead to large-scale citizen disapproval. And more specifically, Putin has channeled participation through a system of citizen appeals. So we can think of a dynamic relationship existing between political participation and regime survival. Many frames that we have for examining political participation are focused on electoral mechanisms of accountability and tolerance for peaceful, organized dissent. And when we look at political participation through that lens, Russian citizens are frequently viewed as being more passive and not particularly mobilized on a mass level. But this framework for considering political participation, a framework that really focuses on democratic forms of participation, might cause us to overlook other forms of engagement that are voluntary in nature. And that's significant because political regimes are more stable when they rely on voluntary compliance, and that requires mechanisms of feedback and accountability. And I would say that one of the mechanisms that has worked in the case of Russia is that the regime stabilized by the participatory process of citizen appeals. In my earlier work, I suggest that we might consider various forms of political participation as falling into two categories of either elite constraining or elite enabling participation. And elite constraining participation impedes leaders from overstepping their constituted authority, primarily by inserting competition into the electoral arena. Elite enabling participation, in contrast, empowers leaders to enhance their formal or informal political authority by building loyalty among constituents who may be willing to tolerate an expansion of elites' power in return for public goods. And my works demonstrated a very strong preference for elite enabling participation in Russia, and this preference has allowed Putin to enhance his formal political authority, in part by formalizing norms of a direct appeal as a channel for both mass participation and for holding elites accountable. So, of course, I think many of us know that there's a long-standing tradition in Russia of appealing to the state power. It dates back to the Muscovite era of petitioning to a benevolent czar. The tradition of citizen appeals evolved even further in the 20th century. It was incorporated into Soviet institutions. It would buttress the idea of a paternalistic state. And in the 21st century, Russians choose to contact public officials because they view this as a more effective way to resolve their complaints and their concerns than through electoral channels. I've also found that citizens don't tend to view direct appeals to members of the state as a form of political participation, but rather they see this as concerning a private matter. However, these appeals do allow the state to monitor performance of lower levels of administration. And I would say that that's a general theme we see in other forms of autocratic rule. There's a very robust literature about this in other countries as well. So to provide a little bit of evidence in support of this argument, this table here provides some data from the Levada Center for a question on civic participation from February 2019. And it asked, are you prepared to participate, and offered a variety of responses. And on the left-hand side, we see 71% of Russians were prepared to vote. But then next to that, 53% are prepared to sign open letters and petitions. 49% are prepared to appeal to organs of state power. So nearly half of the population is willing to say that that's something they're willing to consider, which is much higher than the types of political participation that are often grab more attention, such as participating in political organizations or street protests. This graph here is more recent data from the Levada Center from April 2020, and it asks the question here differently. In the past 12 months, did you? And what I've circled in the middle here are two forms of direct contacting. So the first one is appeal with a suggestion, complaint to state organs, or to signing a collective appeal or petition. So in the past 12 months, 13% of respondents said that they had participated in one of these two activities, which is much higher than the 3% who engaged in protests, and is also, second place among the forms of political participation on this graph. 29% said that they had voted. There's a legal basis that we can think about for the role of citizen appeals, and it goes back to a 2006 law that I want to talk about briefly for a minute. This law starts off by stating that appealing to state organs is a right of all citizens, and then it goes in to provide quite a bit of concrete detail about what these appeals look like. So Article 4 defines an appeal as directed to a state organ, an organ of local self-government, or official and written form in the form of an electronic document as a suggestion, statement, or complaint. And then those three words are then defined more concretely as to what they mean. Article 5 of the law grants applicants the right to receive a written answer to their appeal. And the law also specifies very specific timelines for a course of action. So when a citizen submits an appeal, it needs to be registered and receive a registration number. Different state organs have a timeline by which they need to fulfill requests from various other state organs for additional information to investigate an appeal. And they also have a timeline by which the investigation needs to be completed and the citizen needs to be informed. And lastly, Article 17 of this law sees that it replaces 6 other Soviet-era directives. So this is significant in that it tells us something about the history of this form of participation. Now, one particular mechanism where we see this in place is the president of the Russian Federation's reception, which is an entity that encompasses a broad range of different types of activities. There's a free telephone line from anywhere in the Russian Federation and a direct line where you can give citizen appeals. There's an in-person reception in Moscow that's open 5 days a week, including now there are COVID protocols in place. There's an in-person reception in each of the federal administrative districts. There's a mobile reception where federal officials travel to different Federation subjects to resolve complaints of citizens and organizations about the action or inaction of different levels of government. And what's really interesting about this mobile reception is that they then publish their reports on the Kremlin website. So you can see what the issues were and how the Kremlin is responding to them. There's also an electronic reception, which are computer terminals located in 194 cities with a particular population where people can go and submit their appeal to the president directly through a safe computer terminal. There's also a website system for collecting this information. And this appears to be a fairly widely used system. So this chart here just provides just a basic number of the number of appeals the president has received over the past 10 years. And while the number has gone down over the past 2 years, in 2019, we still had over 700,000 appeals that were sent to the Russian Federation, the president. So it's a very, fairly large system of gathering information. So just to summarize and conclude, political participation can constrain or enable elites. Russians have shown consistent preference for elite-enabling participation, namely a particularized contacting of public officials. And Putin has successfully channeled Russians' preference for appealing to public officials to develop this public reception as a mechanism. It's becoming an institutionalized mechanism for collecting information about citizens, their satisfaction, addressing particularistic concerns, as well as providing oversight to lower levels of government. And in doing so, Putin has essentially placed himself as the benevolent protector of citizens' rights. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, we have Igor Okunev, who is director in the Center for Spatial Analysis and International Relations at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, MGIMO. And he will be presenting on neighborhood effects on electoral behavior in Eurasia, focus on parliamentary elections in Poland and Belarus in 2019. So Igor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Henry. And thank you all for this great opportunity to speak. I will present you 2 cases from big research I'm leading here at MGIMO, and this is a Russian Science Foundation research grant where we are trying to assess the transformation of electoral behavior in all the regions bordering to Russia, from Norway to Mongolia. So we think that there is some impact on the electoral behavior in those regions and it is because it has the same border with Russian Federation. We don't think this impact is very simple, like those who live closer to Russia are more conservative. We think there are different effects and they're connected with ethnicity, with economic, with trade and some other factors. So this is a huge research we are doing, and now I will concentrate on methodology and then on those 2 cases. The timeline for this research is 4 last electoral circles, and we are collecting data on 11 countries, on all the countries where we have at least some kind of elections, free elections. And we do two things here. Well, first, we are doing spatial econometrics of electoral statistics. We collected electoral statistics for all these 4 circles on local level, and we have it with maps and in shape files on our project website. And we do some different methods, mathematic modeling with spatial autocorrelation, with clustering, with finding local indicators of spatial autocorrelation, and finding the geographical regression discontinuity, and many other things. And for the last electoral circle that goes, well, during the project, we do some verification with more simple methods, with field work, with expert interviews, with mass sociological surveys, and with some observations, collecting observations and mapping them with GPS coordinates. You will see how we do this. So we did this for a number of countries. This is a continuing project. And I will present now only 2 cases, 2 research that we already did, finished, analyzed, and that were 2 parliamentary elections that were held last year in Poland and Belarus. And in Poland, we had the field work, and in Belarus, we did mass sociological poll. Well, those are just the maps that we will finally produce, well, some maps and dynamics where we see the changes of this electoral behavior. For example, here we have some changes for the last circle of right forces, conservative forces, with some negative attitude to Russian contemporary politics, and we see in red high autocorrelation cluster, and in blue low autocorrelation clusters of those forces. But well, just an image to see where we are proceeding, and I hope at some stage I will show you the final results. But here more on cases. So in Poland, we went just after the elections, and we went through the border, Russian-Polish border, and we had a sample of 40 towns and villages of different specialization. And there in all these towns, we collected campaign posters in the center, in the main square and surrounding streets of the main square. And we put them in a database, and we connected with them with GPS, so that we then could analyze whether there is some significant, statistically significant increase of campaign posters, of campaign of different parties closer to the border. And then we wanted to compare this with the result. And I need to say that regions on the border with Russia traditionally votes differently in Poland. Well, to the west, this is the most liberal part of the country and the center of liberalism, while the east, Białystok, those close to Belarus, will be, well, probably the most conservative part of the country. And in between, Olsztyn will be some region with the highest number throughout the country for the agriculture parties, well, left conservative party. So they traditionally vote different. And we saw this with, that's how they vote differently. Well, that was the result. When we put this data on CHIM. So the color is the party, and the size is the number of posters. We didn't find any mentions of Russia, what we expected, what we wanted to see, but no, with majoritarian rule, campaign posters are quite specific with only name on them and party name. So we didn't find enough mentions of Russia. And we saw, well, traditionally, well, in different regions, different parties have more campaign posters, with one very important exception. And that was, I think, an interesting point. There was one power confederation, there was one coalition called Confederation. It was far-right populist force, and it was the only party or coalition during the elections that was in favor, I would say, for more let's say, moderate relations with Russia, while all other parties were acting, accusing each other of being Kremlin puppets, and well, they were quite negative about Russian political regime and the future of bilateral relations. So that party was an exception here. And because, as we saw from expert interview, the relations with Russia, with Kaliningrad region, is really important for people who live there. Well, economic ties, tourism, exchanges, well, this is really important for them. So this party strategy was to make more campaign here, to put more posters here, because they wait to have better percentage here, because they appeal to the problems of population, and for them, Russia is an important player here. And they did not succeed. They received the same percentage as before, and lower than in many other places in country, and lower than even in Gdańsk. So with this method, we see the difference between the results and the strategy of the party. So we see that their strategy did not succeed. And I think this is an important finding because there are many scholars and even more politicians in Russia who say that Russia have to rely on those far right parties or populist parties in European politics, because they expect that, well, these parties will collect more moderate views and will act more moderate towards Russia. While we see, even for those people for whom relations with Russia, economic ties is really important for their life, they are not ready for this to change their ideology and to vote for far right political forces. So it does not work. So that's how the method works. Well, second case, we did the poll in Belarus. It was quite, well, a year ago, after all this, before all this crisis, of course. It was after the parliamentary elections. We did analysis, statistical analysis of parliamentary elections, but, well, that's quite not an easy thing to analyze parliamentary elections in Belarus because, well, they don't have dominant party, official party, dominant one. We did huge poll, phone poll with 7,000 polls. We did full 500 full questionnaires with equal regional representation, which was most important for us. And well, there are quite a few of sociology in Belarus, independent sociology. Some of them is provided from Poland, from Czech Republic, so not many of them are coming from Russia. So we did this. There were quite interesting figures there. I will concentrate only on one issue. Well, you could find all the results of this poll on our website, and just in a couple of weeks, we will publish huge articles with all the results in English in Russian Global Affairs. But I will concentrate on one question only. Whether there are some regional disparities, regional difference, whether those regions that are closer to Russia vote, well, they're more loyal to Russia, they're more interested in relations to Russia, they expect Russian topic to be an important topic in the election campaign. So we asked all these questions, and well, the hypothesis was probably in Belarus we see the formatting of the same situation like in Ukraine with East-West, and in Poland, for example, differences, regional differences in election campaign. And we did not find them. Well, for example, this is a question: what should be the relations for Russia the best with Russia? Well, alliance said 57%, partnership 31%, neutral 10%. Very well, pretty much no one said that should be negative relations. But there wasn't a significant difference with these questions and with all other questions between different parts of the country, with one huge exception, and this is Minsk. So we see growing this difference between the capital city and other regions. For example, on this question, we received only 37% votes for alliance in Minsk, while in the border with Poland, for example, it was 57, and the highest number was in Gomel, closer to, well, Russia and Ukraine, the region that has most connections with Ukraine. So 77. And well, I wouldn't say that we have any significant difference, except Minsk. In all the questions, we saw this Minsk separate situation, which I think was one of the explanations for the crisis that happened, where, well, in Minsk, we have specific attitude to politics, to political regime, to relations with Russia. I wouldn't call it negative, but it's more moderate. And the last question I will show, a question, well, I will comment it is in Russian, but I will comment. We did not ask the question like, what should be, would you prefer union with Russia or to be part of European Union? So we did not put people in a situation of a choice. And in this normal situation, we received high number of people who were in favor of good relations with Russia. While some pollsters from Poland, they proposed this choice for people. Here I compare the results with a poll we just did in Georgia, with which we have quite different, very different relations. And in Georgia, well, we received also very high number, 42 number of people for alliance relations or partnership relations. We asked in Georgia, we didn't have this question for Belarus, what should be the relations with European Union? And well, with European Union, well, 28% said there should be alliance, 42 said in Georgia a partnership, and neutral 22. Well, so I mean, back to Belarus, what we see now, that this question of geopolitical choice is not really, that goes from different polls nowadays, this is not really a question on the street. This is not really a question of protest. They do not mark their political choice or their attitude to political regime with their attitudes to either European Union or Russia. So in normal situation, as it should be normal, they want to have good relation with both sides, like in Georgia, like I think in most countries that will be known. So I will stop here. Thank you very much. I will be very glad to answer your question if there will be any.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, very interesting. Before I turn to our final speaker, just let me remind people that you can submit your questions or comments for the speakers to react to via the chat mechanism, either to everybody or through me, and then I will group questions and pose them to the different speakers once we get to the discussion session. But before that, we have our final speaker, Karil Rogoff, who is political analyst at the Liberal Mission Foundation in Moscow, and he will be talking on the theme of More Than a Transition, Non-Democratic Transfer of Power and Regime Dynamics in Post-Soviet Countries. So Karil.
Hi, very nice to see everybody and to participate in this event. In my policy memo prepared for the Council Panars meeting in March 2020, I analyzed the same problem, and my final conclusion was that there are all prerequisites for lifting terms limit in Russia, and that my idea was that institutional logic will push Vladimir Putin to choose this way of solving of his dilemma. The memo was sent to Panars on March 5, and on March 10th, it was announced that an amendment on zeroing the terms. So what was the logic of this? I'll share my... So, yes. So non-democratic transfer of power is a range of manipulative scenarios aimed at maintaining control over the executive office by the incumbents coalition, especially when it faces the threshold of constitutional terms limit. And I see three basic scenarios. The despotic one, it is called continuismo, the electoral administrative, which we know as successor scenario, and the institutional maneuvering scenario. How the regime passes the constitutional constraint for president's duration is the focal point of the regime dynamics. The choice of a particular scenario is determined by the level of political competition in the previous period, while its success or failure determines the political dynamics in the following period. So, why it's not... Yeah. The despotic scenario, continuismo. Continuismo is the term describing the variety of tricks providing a prolongation of current presidency beyond the term's limit. The zeroing of terms counting, a referendum instead of elections, or constitutional amendments, and an extension of tenure from 4, 5 to 6, 7 years, and so on. Usually there are several rounds of continuismo, and this is the process of step-by-step movement to a lifelong presidency. And we saw that in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan till early 2000s, Azerbaijan, Belarus, and now in Russia. There are some prerequisites for this. The first is an extension of the authority of the executive branch at the expense of parliament. The second is an overwhelming electoral domination in the first or second executive elections, more than 75% for incumbent, and a reliable control over the parliament after the first or second parliament elections, more than 60% of seats. Consequences of this despotic scenario is the following. It is not only the same person in the office. It is usually accompanied with the new redistribution of power in favor of executive branch, the so-called institutionalization or even constitutionalization of the concept of presidential supremacy. It is the written and introduced in constitution the domination of presidency over the other branches of power. So in this case, the transfer is of the transfer is not the changing person, but the changing of presidency. So the person is the same, but presidency is another. The electoral administrative scenario, we very well know it like a successor scenario. For example, in Russia in late 1990s, there was pro-presidential 1993 constitution, the result of the violent clash with parliament, but there was not overwhelming electoral domination. Yeltsin's presidential elections of 1996 were competitive, and he hardly won it. And there was no control over the parliament. In this case, there is the second best authoritarian scenario, successor scenario, which is actually a mixture of administrative corruption and patronal networks on the one side and public electoral competition on the other. So it is something in between. And your ability to the popularity matters in this scenario, but it is not all in this scenario. So, for example, Yeltsin's successor Vladimir Putin accumulated huge popularity in 2000, while Leonid Kuchma attempts to repeat the trick with Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine failed. We also have a successful successor scenario in Armenia 2008. And Armenia and Russia demonstrate two possible developments after the successful successor scenario. In Russia, we see the new route of controlled succession, puppet successor Dmitry Medvedev, and further degradation of electoral politics. While in Armenia, we see when this presidential decade was finished, we saw a new scenario. This is the institutional maneuver. The institutional maneuver scenario means a constitutional rearrangement that leads to a redistribution of power. The incumbent coalition, deprived of the opportunity to prolong the presidency, weakens or completely abolishes the institution of presidency, making the prime minister the head of the executive power with no term limits, as it is in parliamentary system. The scenario was discussed and prepared, but not implemented by Kuchma in Ukraine in 2003, by Saakashvili in Georgia 2011, and unsuccessfully implemented by Sargsyan Armenia 2016. Preconditions for the scenario: comparatively high level of pluralism and political competition, and institutionalized opposition. The consequences: while the scenario was never successfully implemented in post-Soviet sphere, the redistribution of power in favor of parliament was fixed in constitutions. And Georgia and Armenia are now parliamentary republics as a result of those preparations for this institutional maneuvering. So, three scenarios and their outcomes demonstrates to what extent elections matter or are dysfunctional in this polity in this moment. In Russia in 2019 and 2020, there were all prerequisites for the despotic scenario. An overwhelming electoral domination, 78% of last presidential elections in 2018, total control of parliament and regional authorities, added to power of 1993 constitution. So, beyond the despotic scenario, what institutional developments we could expect and what are the results, institutional consequences of this? First, it is institutionalized or even constitutionalized personalistic regime. The continuism is accompanied, as I mentioned before, with constitutional amendments which implement the model of supremacy of power of the other branches of power. So it is a sort of formalized institutional framework for an informal patronal pyramid that shapes the expectations of elites and population about the rules of the game. So it is institutionalized personalism. And here we could rethink the personalism concept. Because, for example, when Niyazov in Turkmenistan and Karimov in Uzbekistan died in office, they were immediately replaced with the new persons, and the cult of one personality was easily transferred to other persons. No turbulence, no uncertainty, all the same, nothing happened. It could be compared with the situation in Soviet Union, when it was a sort of the cult of Chia. So the general secretary was a matter of object of cult, and it does not matter if the person in the Chia has charisma or not, has competence or not, had competence or not. It was the cult of Chia. The person was not personalized. Another institutional development, which we see in Kazakhstan, this is the split of electoral legitimacy. Kazakhstan's model of transition is very interesting. While Tokayev possesses an electoral legitimacy, Nazarbayev has a kind of doctrinal legitimacy as the founder of the nation and the guarantor of its sovereignty. This is extended notion of sovereignty. With the situation in Iran, with the role of elected and non-elected authorities in Iran. Another variant of development after the despotic scenario, after the successful despotic scenario, after the lifting term limits, is the hereditary succession, and we see it in Azerbaijan, and we see the institutionalization of hereditary succession in Azerbaijan. And this is another interesting development of this scenario. So, if, when, and why could consolidated and constitutionalized personalistic authoritarian regime collapse or transform? This is the main question for the next decade, and the reason why Belarus's protests are so important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Very interesting presentations to discuss. Maybe I'll just start with one question to Igor, which is kind of clarifying, which asks if maybe you could explain a bit about why one would expect to see cross-border influence. What are the mechanisms of cross-border influence that are there? As I recall from your analysis, it more has to do with the expectation that maybe the people in the border region in Russia. But if you could just elaborate a bit on that, and then I'll have a question for everybody, and again, encourage people to send their questions to the group by chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Mikhail, for a very good question. The theory behind this is this well-known neighborhood effect in electoral geography. We have tendency that people who are close, they vote somehow more similar to neighbors. But this effect was described in internal politics, on internal electoral geography. There are different explanations for this. But the main explanation is that we have a higher level of network between people. And because of this higher network, more complicated network, we see this influence. We think that in cross-border regions, we have the same situation with with high network of contacts, of interests, of communication, of transportation, and so on. With this, we expect that it could also affect on a trans-regional level.
Okay, great, thanks. So what I'd like to do is pose one general question for everybody. Each of you has proposed some interesting frameworks these systems work and how they interact with the public. But what I'd like to ask people is to reflect just a little bit on how the current, how certain aspects of the current crisis are interacting with the dynamics that you describe. And so I have in mind, in particular, everything related to the pandemic. Is this impacting the logic that you're talking about? And also, kind of on the periphery of all of this has been the idea of the protests that have been involved in Belarus, right? I think kind of Karil might have alluded to that. And so, the possibility of demonstration effects, spillover, what have you. So I wonder if each person might just comment briefly on those themes and how they relate to the frameworks that you put forth for thinking about politics. So maybe let's just go in the order that people began. So let's start with Nikolai.
Thank you, Henry. And I'd like to, tell that unfortunately I should leave earlier. That's why I'll drop out in a couple minutes. But in my particular case, when it goes about political transformation in Russia this year, it's, I think, pretty much evident that those plans which have been announced by Putin in January did prevent authorities first from doing as effectively as they could in case of coronavirus epidemic, the first wave, because they were too much focused on the need to amend the constitution and to have this voting as well as military parade. And what is important, I think, it's the fact that earlier there was calculation, and that's why Putin in his presidential address in January first came with the idea how much money the Kremlin will give each and everybody to make political background for the political transformation. All this money, which have been planned to be distributed, were written by first pandemic and then oil prices drop down. That's why it was needed to revise national projects. That's why the Kremlin still is trying to maneuver in order to, for all political transformation plans to be realized and to be well accepted by Russian population.
Okay, thank you. Danielle.
So I would say, I think that the citizen appeal process as a mechanism both for citizen engagement and for elite monitoring of various aspects of the government seems fairly resilient within the current crisis. As I mentioned, that the Moscow reception is still open with COVID protocols for citizens to attend. I don't know about elsewhere, but also the fact that the appeals process is something that is documented and written means that that individuals can still participate in it in a physical distancing manner. But I think the real element of resilience that's relevant here is that the Kremlin controls this information. So they decide, so even though there's a legal process by which appeals are treated, it provides the Kremlin with enormous volumes of information that it can use to maybe prioritize how to manage various elements of administrative strain at lower levels of the government. So if they're receiving large numbers of appeals from particular regions and addressing particular areas, they can allocate resources to sort of dealing with those in a way that might prevent further unrest. So I think it serves as a fairly resilient mechanism for managing lower levels of government. And to tie into, I think, part of the discussion from the Plenar's Eurasia Friday last week, we were talking about sort of one of the points of conversation would be that we were talking about was whether or not, how would authoritarian leaders come out of this pandemic? And I think that the really interesting thing is that the citizen appeals process is a way to help build up that informal authority by having these back channels of communication that can be used to allocate resources and really shape the story that's being told. So I would say that I think that this shows some potential ways to manage public expectations and manage the story that's being told.
Okay, great. Igor.
Thank you for the question. Well, the effects we are looking for are more long-standing effects. So I would not expect to measure the concrete crisis, Corona crisis, or protests in Minsk that, of course, they affected the electoral behavior, they affected the context, but we will want to see more long-standing impact. Well, here probably the thing we see is that in Belarus, what happened is not just a result of some last particular changes, well, like Corona crisis. Well, I think we saw really huge difference, huge change in the country, change in the society, change in the economics, change in the civil society. Change in what we're interested in, electoral geography and regional disparities. So that happened not yesterday, not half of a year ago. It happened during the last decade. And we see just the first result of this huge change. And yes, here we see this change. But overall, I wouldn't assess some small crisis impact. I would prefer to look on long-standing impact.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think that effect of epidemic to political effect of epidemic is very low in Russia. Its influence on political agenda, on its influence in political mood and behavior is very, very weak. And this is paradoxical for me, and I think it needs to be discussed and analyzed. And I think it is the situation in many countries. In Russia, I see two main arguments. First of all, it is understood. It looks like some external shock for Russian population. So the government is not able. It is not its fault. Government's fault. And the second argument I have why the political consequences of pandemic is so low, so weak. My idea is that in most of countries, and in Russia in particular, there are two groups in the society. There are enthusiasts of lockdown and restrictions, and there are dissidents of lockdown and restrictions. And those two groups are divided on not political background, not socially background, but this division, this split, makes their political influence and political attitudes connected with pandemic and very, very weak, because the society is also split on the very different matter. And it was paradoxical in Russia that that was the year when this continuism, Putin's continuism, this amendment on the third term was introduced. And I think that we saw in many countries that the political agenda and political mobilizations, they are not connected, they are not influenced by pandemic. Yes, if there is mobilization, people go to the streets and protest and everything they do as it is normal life. If there's no mobilization, there is not mobilization, and it is not because of pandemic. So in Russia, we see that while the opposition to the amendment was very strong, there was no organized mobilization at all, and that was the cause of the political depression we see in Russian society in the second half of the year, and it is not connected with pandemic.
Okay, great. Pose one question to each speaker that I've gotten. So for Danielle from Regina, asks, data suggest a sense of the generational effects on who and whether or not younger people are different. Is there a generational effect on participation patterns? And for Igor, there's a question, there's interest in asking you to elaborate on how people in Minsk responded to your questions, since you mentioned they were different. And then for Karil, for Mariusz Marszewski, why has the authoritarian system collapsed in Kyrgyzstan since the beginning of the 2000s, not being able to recover since then, basically, kind of remaining unstable through the present day? So maybe can we go in reverse order this time? We'll start with Karil and then go to Igor, then Danielle, and then I have another set of questions.
Yes, thank you for the question. But my answer will be short and not interesting. And the first thing I want to say is no. It will be short. And the main idea is that I'm not specialist in Kyrgyz society and the situation within the republics, but it is visible for me, and I'm sure that the main cause is the situation within Kyrgyz elites and this split of the country for separate for different regions, and actually we can see the very close, very similar situation in some African countries. You know that actually we usually are focused on post-communist countries when we are discussing the transition. But this is the panel, the post-communist countries is the panel of about 30 countries in Eurasia that experienced liberalization in early 19th. 1990s. And also we have the panel of about 40 or more countries in Africa that experienced liberalization in the early 90s. When we're speaking about this Central Asia set of Eurasian panel, it is very fruitful to compare with African panel. And there we will see in some countries the same situation, where these regional divisions are very, very, very strong, and you cannot make these centralized patronal pyramids there. So because the country exists separated for several regions, which have its own consolidated elite, and those elites, this splitting forms shapes the political dynamic of the country.
Great, thank you.
Yes. Well, if we speak about relations with Russia, well, if in general in country, 55 to 60% was for alliance relations with Russia. In Minsk, it was only 38%, 1/3 lower. And about neutral relations, if in general we had 5 to 10% in different regions, in Minsk it was 18%, so pretty much double. So, well, in this question you see quite significant change. Well, in some questions, for example, there was a question: do you think that relations with Russia should be an important topic for electoral campaign? Minsk answer pretty much the same as the other country. So, well, all the results, not to waste time, will be published in a couple of weeks in Russian Global Affairs English language issue.
Great, thank you. Danielle.
Thank you for this question. So I'm going to try to answer it in a few different ways. The first is that I can't speak directly about generational effects because the appeals process that I was presenting and I've been examining today does not, the way I've been looking at those data, I don't have information on the ages of the applicants. However, I can say that based on other types of work that I've looked at, I do think there are generational effects. I do believe that the citizens' appeals process is primarily used by individuals who are middle-aged and older, and I think that there are lots of reasons for that. Of course, you know, as you mentioned, that there's a Soviet effect element to this, but I think that there's something broader than just it being a generational form of participation that is likely to be replaced by other types of engagement for a few reasons. So one is even the way that the process of appeals is divided up. And if you look in particular at the presidential reception appeals, there's a specific way to submit a report on corruption, right? So it's got its own category. And I think that speaks to a response, I would say, to broader complaints within the political culture about levels of corruption within the regime, and that this is a particular attempt by the administration to find a different way to channel frustration or anger or discontent about corruption as opposed to just street protests. Now, to the extent, well, I don't know whether or not those who's using the reporting of corruption, but I think that speaks as to a certain degree as a proactive way of trying to bring in that younger generation. I have seen in other appeals processes younger people participating, often with very specific goals in mind, something that has to do with a municipal service. So I'm thinking of an example of a student signature forum to have more buses to to travel the route that their university was, and that was something that had been successfully appealed. Now, one of the things I've also learned is that individuals who engage in an appeal process if they have a positive experience, they're more likely to engage in it again. So I think that also speaks to the desire to bring a younger generation into this, with the idea being that they will channel their political interests through this form of engagement. The other point I'll just add in terms of answering this question about generational effects is that even though I found in other types of research that younger people were less likely to engage in citizen appeals, I also found that they were less likely to engage in non-voting political participation more broadly. So it wasn't just that they chose different types of participation; they just participated less overall. Now that I would imagine that this is still something we're going to continue to look at and monitor and potentially see change in. Thanks.
Okay, great. So now I have a question for everybody, which also comes from Regina. And just by the way, I would mention I have on my desk, hot off the press, her brand new book, which I highly recommend. So she has a question, which is, in the general sense, all the speakers seem to point, or at least most of the speakers seem to point to a decline in institutional constraints on political behavior and outcomes, even as the Kremlin continues to redefine institutions. But they seem to differ on what will determine outcomes. So Nikolai's elite conflict hydra, Igor's structural factors. So she asked if the speakers might comment on the most important causal factors in the political system in the next year. So let's see, I guess, Danielle, can we start with you and just go back in the original order, or we can go reverse if you like, so.
That's a hard question to go first on, but I'll give my best attempt here. Sort of what I think the most important causal factors are. So I'm a big supporter of thinking about political change as a dynamic process, and so when we think about the which factors, we have to look at where there is dynamism and where there's change. And I think that in this respect, I would say I'm very sympathetic to the points that all of my co-panelists have already raised about this. And in particular, this idea of institutions as being, the idea of institutionalized personalism as being something that we really should be looking at, right? So when we think about that, what is driving that causal force, I think where is there a gap between what the formal institutions are providing and where the population and other actors in the system want them to be providing. And that's where we're going to see dynamism for potential change, right? So I think that one of the points that Kirill raised that I thought was just very, very important to this conversation is the fact that the pandemic doesn't seem to be shaping these different elements that we see in terms of where you see nascent institutionalization of other types of activity and the decay of other types of political institutions. So it's not going to be in the domestic response to the pandemic. It does make me wonder whether or not balance of power issues outside of the Russian regime are going to, if Russia has maintained its domestic political prowess through the pandemic, to what extent is it going to be shaping its foreign policy outlook differently in response to the fact that other states in the global arena have not emerged, if you will, from the pandemic without internal political conflict?
Okay, terrific. So Igor.
Well, I would think about this cause as the main cause about the political culture and electoral culture, electoral behavior, and still dominating objective political culture in Russia, in Belarus, probably even in Poland, and in most post-Soviet, post-communist countries. It also changes. It changes very slow, but I think that will be dominant factor. And if we speak about Russia, and what will be interesting for me, this regional disparities, differences, we see growing difference in political culture between different regions. So we see huge appeal for participation, and we see developing participatory political culture in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Novosibirsk, in Yekaterinburg, in Khabarovsk, we see now. And we see still very parochial political culture in the Caucasus, in some small towns in Arctic. not only in national republic. So, so it's huge problem for Kremlin to propose some policy that will unite, that will answer to very different political culture and very different appeals, traditional appeals from one region, and modernization, transformation appeal from the cities. That's really a huge question to find this balance here, and that I think that's the task they're trying to do. And well, it seems bad from both sides, from traditional sides, from modernization side, but I think that's the biggest challenge Kremlin is trying to overcome.
Great, Kirill.
Yeah, if we're speaking about the factors and causes of political dynamics in next year and maybe in 2 or 3 years, I think there is one factor, the most important. It is occasional, but it is a real factor, and the most important trend in public attitudes, in public opinion in Russia of last 2 years. This is the trend of huge divergence of informational consumption of the younger and elder generations. So now in Russia we have 2 nations. One is elder than 55, the one is between 18 till 40. And the informational consumption, the sources for their picture of the world, of everything, differs very much. I mean that for younger generations, it between 18 and 40, one of the main sources is social networks. For elder generations, it is TV. So they have very different picture of the events of everything. But the problem is that Russia is an old country, and people older 55 is about 37% of population. And people between 18 and 40 also is about 35, 36% of population. But this divergence is very important, and I do not know exactly what will happen. But this is the main source of political potential source of political dynamics in next years, I believe.
Okay, I think we are winding to the close of our discussion. So I think let me just see if the presenters have any final comments they'd like to make before we wrap things up. Danielle?
No, other than I look forward to reading and hearing more of what my co-presenters shared today. And I also look forward to reading Regina's book.
Yeah, you got it.
No, just once again, thanks for this great moderation and that great session with many great insights.
Great, Kirill.
It's a great event, and it was very interesting. And this format is good. It's of course it's a little bit pity that you couldn't see the people who ask the questions. It also is very yes, very exciting. But it's yeah, you can imagine them.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists and to Nikolai, who had to leave early, for a great discussion. I learned a lot, and like Danielle said, I look forward to seeing the publications of those that have already come out or that haven't come out yet when they come out. And please, so join me in thanking everybody, and look forward to the time we can all get together in person.